Hi, I'm Jonah,
And I'm Alana.
and we're students from the Bialik College in Melbourne, currently studying at Alexander Mas High School in Israel.
We are here with Dr. Dave Sharma, the Australian Ambassador to Israel. Thank you so much for coming and agreeing to the interview.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So we just want to find out a little bit about yourself.
Of course. Look, I've been the Australian Ambassador to Israel now for the past 18 months. It's the best job I've ever had. It's a great country to live in, as you're discovering on your trip here, and it's also a very important relationship for Australia. I'm relatively young for an Australian Ambassador. I'm 38, and I've been in our foreign ministry for about the last 15 or 16 years. So I've sort of come to this through, the career foreign service, and I've also served overseas previously in Washington DC and in Papua New Guinea.
What do you do in your role as an ambassador, and have you always wanted to be a diplomat?
Look, the role of an ambassador is varied, but basically it means I'm Australia's representative here in Israel. So it means I'm a spokesperson for government policies, I'm an advocate for Australian government interests, and I'm sort of the eyes and ears of the Australian government here in Israel to tell them what's happening in Israel that matters to Australia. It might be politically, it might be economically, socially or culturally. So it's kind of like, I'm running the field office for a major multinational, except it's a government rather than the private sector. Have I always wanted to be a diplomat? Look, I think I actually studied medicine for a year, so for a while there I wanted to be a doctor. But I think when I was studying medicine, I realised that I had an interest in world affairs, and I wasn't going to satisfy that by being a doctor. It was always going to be a hobby rather than a profession, and I'd rather it become a profession. So it wasn't something I thought I'd do when I was growing up, but when I got up to about 20 or 21, I sort of was attracted to this path as a way of living and working overseas and learning a bit more about the world.
Cool. So we know that, as you just said, you've previously lived in other countries. Why did your family move to Australia from Canada?
Look, I've got a sort of mixed background. My father's actually, he's Indian ethnically, but from Trinidad and Tobago in the West Indies. My mother's Australian. They met in London. I was born in Canada, but eventually we settled back in Australia because that's where my mother's family was from and still is from. So I've always I've moved to Australia when I was about 3 or 4. I've still got Canadian citizenship, but I've always sort of considered myself to be an Australian. That's basically my identity.
How has your recent move to Israel impacted you and your family?
It's impacted us, but in a really positive way. I think we've been really very pleasantly surprised about how easily we found it to settle in here, how welcoming people have been towards us, how fondly Australians are regarded here, and how similar the two countries are. I mean, you'll be discovering this if you're in Tel Aviv. It feels a lot like somewhere I'm from, Sydney, the northern beaches of Sydney, for instance. It's a similar sort of relaxed and informal attitude towards personal interactions, which Australians know well. It's a very embracing approach of life, I think, here in Israel, which Australians know well. Of course, there are differences between the two countries, and although events in Sydney overnight have been a tragic reminder that no country is immune from what's going on in the world, generally speaking, in Australia, we don't have the same sorts of security and existential fears that people living here in Israel do have. But there's a lot of similarities between the two countries as well.
So did you want to be assigned to work in Israel specifically?
Yeah, I was very keen to come here because, look, it's a fascinating part of the world. It's a great country to live in, and it's an important relationship for Australia. And I think the size and the activism of the Jewish community in Australia as well is a really important strength to the relationship too.
What do you hope to achieve in your current role in Israel?
It's a good question. You think I know this off the top of my head? There's 3 things that I've been focused on. One is to try and import some of the Israeli entrepreneurial and innovative spirit into Australia. I think there's a lot we can learn from Israel and the sort of the startup nation model, the amount of entrepreneurial activity is and high-tech innovation. Australia is sort of really in need of that high value-added sort of knowledge-intensive industries and expertise, and I think we can learn from Israel about how do you set up a system that incentivises that sort of economic activity. I'd like to do more to increase awareness, especially here in Israel, about Australia's role that we played here in World War One. We're coming up to the 100th anniversary of a lot of the World War One battles next year with Gallipoli, but importantly in 2017, the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Beersheba, where Australian light horsemen were instrumental in the fall of Beersheba, the breaking of the lines there, and what was eventually a very successful campaign to defeat the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. And that campaign really laid the foundations for the Middle East as we know it today, including the creation of the State of Israel. So in that sense, the history of our two countries has been intertwined, almost from the very beginning, from before the years of Israel's creation as a state and from the very early years of Australia's independence. And I think the older generations of people here in Israel are aware of that, but the younger generations obviously less so. And I'd like to use the opportunity of the 100-year anniversary to sort of strengthen that a little more.
So you've been very active on Twitter during the Operation Protective Edge, posting condemnations of rocket attacks on Israel and photos of your embassy staff in a shelter after missile attacks. So here's one of your tweets. Condemn barrage of rockets from Gaza tonight, targeting and terrorizing civilians. Call for calm and cessation of violence. And here's another one. Bracing myself and the kids for another evening of rockets, as are millions all over Israel. So we want to know, how has social media changed the face of diplomacy, and why is it important for you to use Twitter?
Yeah, look, I'm a big believer in not just social media, but having a sort of a publicly visible embassy and ambassador. And I think it's important because diplomacy has changed. I mean, diplomacy 100 years ago was really conducted between the governing elites of two countries, administration to administration. But nowadays, particularly in countries like ours with a vibrant democracy and a very sort of representative and politically accountable governments, if you're to influence opinions or to have a say, you need to be talking to the public as well as to the government. And social media is obviously a way to talk unfiltered to the public and to get your message out. So I think it's important, if you want to be an effective diplomat and representative for your country, you need to talk to a whole number of audiences in the country. Social media is one way of doing that. The other thing I think is that, ultimately I'm paid for by the taxpayer in Australia. I'm accountable to the government, but ultimately I'm accountable to the Australian public. And they have a right to know what I'm doing, what I'm thinking, how I'm representing Australia here. They have a right to criticise the job I'm doing or disagree with me. And if you look at my Twitter feed, I get some of that as well, and that's fine. That's all part of the game. It keeps you honest. But I think it's important for people to sort of to lift the veil from what an embassy does and for people to see it in day-to-day operations. So I think that's an important tool of accountability as well to the Australian public.
We were amazed to hear of the Australian Twitter initiative, #I'll Ride With You, following yesterday's events in Sydney, where Australians across the country offered a hand to their fellow citizens of Muslim descent to make them feel safe travelling in public transport. So far, it has been used over 150,000 times and has shown the Australians' unwillingness to cave to terrorism. How do you think Australia is different from the rest of the world in its response to terrorism?
It's a good question. I mean, the I'll Ride With You initiative has been a really positive response to what's an otherwise very tragic sort of set of episodes or set of circumstances overnight. I don't know if our response is so different. We're lucky that we haven't been the victims of this sort of terrorism, or not the frequent victims, at least on Australian soil. Of course, we've known it, quite well in Bali and Jakarta and in New York over the past decade or a little more. But I think we've always prided ourselves on being a tolerant nation that's respectful of differences, and that we draw strength from our sort of multicultural and multi-ethnic fabric. And I think what we've shown is that we don't and we won't let incidents of violence or attempts at intimidation allow us to deviate from those values or weaken those values. And I think that's a strength of Australian society. I mean, it's shared elsewhere as well. I wouldn't say it's unique, but I think it's a particularly strong trait in Australia.
So we want to know, did Australia contact Israel for advice on the terrorist attack yesterday?
I had some calls from Israelis. We didn't ask for advice, but we did appreciate the messages of solidarity and support that we got from all walks of Israeli life: politicians, media personalities, government ministers, government officials, people on the street. That was very much appreciated. I think in terms of the situation was, so fast moving, and we do have a high degree of expertise on this within our own police forces. So we weren't seeking assistance, but support and solidarity at this sort of time is always valued.
Tell us about your work with US President Barack Obama.
Look, me personally, I was before I came here, I worked in the Prime Minister's department in Canberra, and I was closely involved in his visit to Australia in November 2011, which was his first visit as president. I think the first presidential visit we'd had in about 8 years, I think, and quite a historic one. He spoke to the Australian Parliament, but he also announced what we call the US rebalance, if you like, to the Asia Pacific, or an increased focus amongst the US political, economic and security arms on the Asia Pacific as a region. And Australia is a big part of that picture, and it's something that we're very keen to encourage. So, look, I was involved from all sorts of things, from the sort of the high policy stuff about, what the Prime Minister would say in her meeting with Barack Obama, this is Julie Gillard at the time, to the pretty sort of low sort of stuff about how many people would be allowed into the meeting, what sort of gift we should buy President Obama, where people should sit at the dinner table or for the dinner in the Great Hall. So from the sort of the mundane to the profound. But it was a great visit and it went very well.
So we'd just like to say thank you for speaking to us. We really appreciate the opportunity, and thank you again.
Thank you both, and thanks for your interest in talking to me.
Thanks.